Picture this. It's 5:48 on a freezing Tuesday morning inside Hangar 4 at Oakhaven Regional Airport. The air smells like burnt kerosene, cold steel, and fresh hydraulic fluid. Standing on that grease-stained concrete is a 54-year-old mechanic named Arthur Pendelton, wearing faded blue coveralls with his name stitched over the pocket in thread that turned from yellow to white 10 years ago. And standing right in front of him, wrapped in a $3,000 tailored wool coat, is Victoria Vance, the 42-year-old chief executive officer of Vance Aerodynamics. Before Arthur can get 3 words out, Victoria reaches forward, unclips the plastic employee ID badge off his chest, and drops it right onto the floor. It hits the concrete with a sharp snap right between his steel-toed boots. "You have 10 minutes to clear that flight control lockout, Pendleton," she says, her voice echoing off the corrugated steel walls so loud that 30 mechanics freeze in place. 10 minutes to make that $84 million jet airworthy, or pick up your trash and get out. You're finished. Now, here's what Victoria Vance didn't know at 5:48 that morning. She had no idea the quiet, gray-haired man she had just humiliated in front of her entire ground crew was the only person in 3 states who understood why her flagship jet was sitting frozen on the tarmac, or that inside line 4407 of the aircraft's hidden diagnostic log, a single digital signature was about to drag her top executive out into the light. What was really hiding inside Cabinet 4B beneath all that cold aluminum? Now, you have to understand why that moment on the tarmac hurt the way it did. 28 years. That's how long Arthur had given to Vance Aerodynamics. 28 years of crawling inside tight fuselage trunks, tracing copper wiring until his fingertips were calloused and numb, smelling like turbine oil when he came home to eat supper. He wasn't a talker. In his trade, talk was cheap, precision was everything. You measure twice, you torque to spec, and you never sign off on a job unless you'd stake your own child's life on the work. For 26 of those years, he was lead avionics. When a multi-million-dollar bird threw a ghost fault no computer diagnostic could track down, the younger techs didn't look at the manual. They went to Arthur. He'd sit on a flipped-over 5-gallon bucket with a multimeter in his hand, listening to the hum of the relays like a doctor listening to a heartbeat through a stethoscope, and within 20 minutes, he'd point his finger right at a hair-fractured ground wire hidden beneath 6 layers of shrink tubing. Then came 2 years ago. During a routine overhaul, Arthur pulled inspection panel 3B on a charter jet and found something that made his blood run cold. A batch of high-pressure hydraulic control valves had shallow, stamped casting numbers instead of deep-forged marks. Arthur didn't guess. He pulled out his personal brass micrometer, the one his late father handed him back in 1988, and measured the valve housings down to the thousandth of an inch. They were off by 4 thousandths. Under extreme altitude pressure, those housings would stress fracture. He wrote a 50-page report and walked it right into the office of Maintenance Director Gordon Price, 41 years old, golf-tanned, and obsessed with streamlining operational expenditure. Price shoved Arthur's report into a bottom drawer, called him paranoid, and 3 days later reassigned Arthur's office to a broom closet by the compressor room. Price stripped his title, cut his pay by $12 an hour, and demoted him to basic walk-around inspections. He told the younger techs Arthur was losing his grip, and that his eyes couldn't read diagnostic screens anymore. Most of them swallowed the lie. They stopped sitting near Arthur at lunch. Arthur didn't yell. He just put his brass micrometer in his right pocket and kept showing up every morning at 5 a.m. Why? Because 3 years ago, Arthur lost his wife, Sarah, to cancer, leaving him alone with their 11-year-old daughter, Chloe, and 6 years left on a mortgage. And tonight, Tuesday night at 6:30, was Chloe's district science fair at Lincoln Middle School. They'd spent 3 weeks building a model balsamwood glider at the kitchen table. Before Arthur walked out into the dark that morning, Chloe had taped a handwritten note in purple ink to his thermos, "Don't forget, Dad. 6:30, seat 12. At 5 a.m., Arthur started his morning walk-around on the Apex Horizon 7, Victoria Vance's flagship jet. Passing the lower avionics access door under the nose wheel well, he paused. Yellow tamper seal number 8812 had been logged as inspected by Gordon Price at 9:30 p.m. yesterday. But Arthur's eye caught something wrong. The vinyl edge was cut, not peeled, and a sliver of red rubber gasket material stuck out where it didn't belong. Arthur measured the gap with his micrometer, noted it in his black pocket notebook, and didn't touch it. Without a written work order, Price would have him escorted off the grounds. At 5:30 a.m., black SUVs pulled up. Out stepped Victoria Vance and Chief Operating Officer Richard Sterling, 58, tailored suit, smooth gray hair, and a voice like river stones. Sterling was pressing her hard. If we aren't in Chicago on LaSalle Street by 7:30 a.m. sharp for the refinancing vote, Harrison's faction forces a motion of no confidence. You lose operational control before lunch. What Victoria didn't know was that missing that vote was Sterling's secret trap to trigger a default and buy 60% of the company for 14 cents on the dollar. Inside the cockpit, Captain Julian Mercer and First Officer Thomas Brent hit the starter for Engine 1. A second later, red warning banners exploded across the screens. Flight Control Bus A unresponsive. Fuel manifold out of range. System lockout code 4407. 3 independent systems dead on the exact same millisecond. Price trotted out, claiming a 90-minute main bus failure and pushing to delay the flight. Sterling whispered in Victoria's ear, pointing right at Arthur standing near the battery cart. Price lied on the spot, claiming Arthur was hovering around the hatch at 5:15. That's when Victoria snapped, grabbed Arthur's ID badge, threw it down, and gave him the 10-minute ultimatum. Arthur picked up his badge, wiped the floor oil off the plastic with his sleeve, and tucked it into his breast pocket. He looked Victoria straight in the eye. "If I'm fixing your airplane in 10 minutes, Ms. Vance," Arthur said, his voice flat as granite, "you're going to follow 3 rules. First, nobody touches a switch in that cockpit except Captain Mercer under my direct instruction. Second, Mr. Price stays 10 feet back. Third, I want the raw diagnostic data stream fed directly to the workbench monitor right now, not the summary screen Price is holding." He pulled a red digital countdown timer out of his drawer, slapped it on the bench, and hit start. The digits blinked, 9:59. 9:58. While 99 technicians would plug in a factory computer and wait for a light to turn green, Arthur trusted math over guesswork. He stepped to the lower bay hatch, smelled a faint trace of warm silicone running 60 degrees hot, and looked inside cabinet 4B. "Mr. Price," Arthur called out, "where is backup module BCU 400 that was pulled for scrap 3 months ago?" Price stammered that it had been sent to the waste vendor. "That's strange," Arthur said, reaching deep into slot 3. "Because I tested BCU 400 3 months ago at 99.8% compliance. And if it was scrapped, Gordon, why is it sitting right here in cabinet 4B with a yellow tag signed in blue pen?" He pulled out a pristine black metal module. Near the hangar door, Regional Compliance Officer Miriam Hayes stood up. She knew Vance policy banned paper tags signed in pen 18 months ago. She pulled out her tablet and began recording Arthur's workbench. Arthur pointed a calloused finger at the scrolling raw signal graph on the screen. "Look at the microfluctuations, Captain. Voltage drops of exactly 0.0004 volts, repeating on a 400 millisecond loop across 3 separate systems. Fuel pumps and elevator controls don't fail on the exact same millisecond pulse. Physics doesn't work that way. A digital signal generator plugged into diagnostic port number 2 does." Arthur reached his arm deep into the bay, gripped a small silver box tapped directly into the master bus lines, and gave it a firm tug. The foam tape released with a sharp pop. "Your airplane didn't fail, Ms. Vance," Arthur said, holding the device high for every pilot and mechanic to see. Somebody installed a hardware parasite into your master bus at 2 o'clock this morning. Now, you have to picture Gordon Price's face right then. I mean really picture it. That smug, $90 haircut confidence vanished so fast you'd think somebody pulled the plug on it. The whole hangar went dead silent. You could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the cooling fans inside cabinet 4B, and the slow, steady drip of hydraulic fluid into a catch pan 50 feet away. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Not Captain Vance. Not the 2 test pilots standing by the nose gear. Not even Miriam Hayes with her tablet held midair. Then Price did what men like him always do when they get caught with their hand in the register. He tried to turn the room around. He planted it. Price shouted, stepping right past the 10-foot boundary Arthur had set. His voice echoed off the steel rafters. Look at him. He's been bitter about the regional restructuring for 6 months. He knew we were running a full diagnostic audit today. He snuck in here, tapped the bus line himself, and now he's playing the hero so you won't cut his pension. Now, what would you have done? If a man 20 years younger than you, a man who's never held a wrench in his life, stood in front of your boss and called you a saboteur? Most folks would yell. They'd throw a fist, or at least start waving their hands. Arthur didn't even blink. He just reached into his front shirt pocket, pulled out a small, tarnished brass feeler gauge, the edges worn mirror smooth from 40 years of engine grease, and laid it flat on the rubber mat next to the parasite box. That little brass gauge had been in his pocket on every flight line from Chicago to Atlanta since 1984. It was his anchor. Day 2 of the audit, Arthur said quietly, his voice carrying straight over the noise of the floor fans. 0500 hours. Check the security log for door 4, Ms. Hayes. Miriam Hayes tapped her tablet screen. Her thumb paused. Keycard entry at 2:14 this morning, she read out loud. Master maintenance pass. Price pointed a trembling finger at Arthur. There. See? He's got master access. Keep reading, Ms. Hayes, Arthur said, taking a slow breath. Tell them whose name is hard-coded to that specific master pass. Miriam looked down at the encrypted log file. Pass number 8802. Issued to Gordon Price, Regional Operations Manager. Price's jaw worked, but no sound came out. That card was stolen out of my desk 2 weeks ago. I filed a report. You filed the report this morning at 7:30, Hayes said, her voice dropping into that terrifying, quiet register that bureaucrats only use when somebody is about to go to federal prison. 10 minutes before Captain Vance walked through the main gate. Right then, the red digital timer on Arthur's workbench beeped once. 4:12, 4:11. 4 minutes left on the clock he'd set. A small crisis inside a big one. Because off in the distance, out on taxiway Bravo, the engine spool-up whistle of the morning flight schedule was already beginning to rumble through the floorboards. If that diagnostic stream wasn't cleared and certified by 0600, 2 regional jets were going to be grounded on the tarmac, costing the company $42,000 every 15 minutes. And Gordon Price knew it. It doesn't matter whose card it was. Price barked, desperate now, turning to Captain Vance. The code on that parasite box is sophisticated. It's military-grade telemetry bypass. A 62-year-old line mechanic who barely knows how to log into his email couldn't write that software if you gave him 10 years. He had an accomplice. Arthur picked up his brass feeler gauge. He turned it over in his calloused fingers, the cold metal fitting right into the groove carved by decades of work. You're right about one thing, Gordon, Arthur said, looking Price dead in the eye. A line mechanic couldn't write that code. Arthur leaned over the workbench, tapped 3 keys on the diagnostic monitor, and pulled up the hardware vendor signature embedded in the silver box's microchip. "That's an old 7 Alpha protocol architecture," Arthur told the room. "Designed back in 1996 for the Air National Guard transport fleet. It doesn't run on modern digital buses without an analog bridge interface." He tapped the silver box with the tip of his thumb. "And there are only 4 people left in this state who know how to hand solder a 7 Alpha bridge onto a late-model Vance bus." Miriam Hayes stepped closer, squinting at the screen. She read the system developer registration number scrolling along the bottom line of the diagnostic output, DEV 041 AP. She stopped. She looked at the screen, then at the tarnished brass gauge in Arthur's hand, stamped with those exact same initials near the pivot rivet, AP, 1984. Developer 041. Hayes whispered, her eyes going wide as she looked up at the quiet old man in the greasy blue coveralls. "You didn't just learn how to fix these systems, Arthur. You wrote the original FAA certification manual for them." Captain Vance looked between Arthur and the monitor, her hands slowly coming off her belt. "Arthur, who are you?" Arthur didn't answer right away. You know how some men get when they think they've finally got the upper hand. They puff out their chest, they raise their voice, and they make sure everybody in a 50-foot radius knows they were right all along. Not Arthur. He just pulled a greasy red shop towel out of his back pocket and calmly wiped a dark smear of soot off the brass feeler gauge. "I'm the guy who spent 38 years making sure these birds stayed in the air, Captain," Arthur said, his voice as steady as a concrete pillar. "And right now, you've got 38 minutes before 0600. Now, picture Gordon Price at that exact moment." Sweat was literally dripping off the tip of his nose, landing right on his crisp white silk tie. His eyes were darting from the diagnostic monitor back to Arthur, desperate for anything, any technicality, to crawl out from under. "It doesn't change the liability." Price snapped, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger at the silver parasite box. "Even if he built the legacy framework, he accessed an encrypted system without a Class A clearance badge. That's a federal security violation. Captain, as Regional Director of Operations, I am ordering you to escort him off this tarmac immediately." Captain Vance didn't even look at Price. She kept her eyes locked on Arthur. "Quiet, Gordon," she said, so soft you almost couldn't hear it over the low hum of the floor scrubbers. But before Price could argue, the overhead warning siren in Bay 4 started wailing. 5:22 a.m. 38 minutes to 0600. A strobe light flared amber across the high steel ceiling beams. Over the radio speaker mounted on the brick wall, a frantic young crew chief was practically screaming into his headset, "Hangar 1, this is Gate 12. Flight 412's main gear lockout valve just slammed shut. The automated system is reporting a pressure spike, 14,000 pounds per square inch. It's going to blow the main hydraulic seal in 2 minutes and dump 40 gallons of fluid across the tarmac." Price lunged forward and grabbed the desktop radio mic, his knuckles turning chalk white. "Initiate full digital purge," he yelled into the microphone. "Cycle the master circuit breakers. Hard reboot from the central server." "No." Arthur's voice cut through the noise like a blast from an air horn. He didn't shout often, but when he did, you felt it in the soles of your boots. He stepped across the concrete floor, grabbed Price by the wrist with a hand hardened by 40 years of turning wrenches, and forced the mic away. "If you hit that digital reboot with 14,000 pounds of head pressure, you'll shear the mechanical bypass pin on the landing gear strut," Arthur told him, looking Price right in the pupils. "You won't just ground the flight, Gordon. You'll drop 30 tons of steel right onto those boys working the wheel well." Price sneered, trying to pull his wrist free, but Arthur's grip didn't budge an inch. "I hold a master's in systems architecture from Purdue, Arthur." Price spat. You're a line mechanic. You don't tell me how a modern fly-by-wire valve operates. Now, what would you have done right there? Because Arthur didn't waste another second arguing. He didn't pull rank, and he didn't raise his voice. He just reached down, picked up his heavy steel toolbox by the handle, tucked his brass feeler gauge into his front coverall pocket, and started moving toward the catwalk stairs faster than a man 62 years old had any right to move. "Vance, follow me," Arthur called over his shoulder. "Miriam, get on that wall console and hold the auxiliary bleed valve at 40%. Don't let Price touch that keyboard." By the time Arthur and Vance hit the cold, oil-slick tarmac under Flight 412, the smell of scorching hot hydraulic fluid was already thick enough to coat the back of your throat. Down underneath the port wing, 3 young mechanics in high-visibility vests were backing away in terror, watching a thick steel fluid line vibrate violently against its mounting brackets. A high-pitched, scream-like whine echoed out of the wheel housing, the sound of metal expanding right before a structural fatigue snap. "The digital override locked us out," the lead young chief shouted over the screech, his eyes wide behind his safety glasses. "The new software says the valve doesn't exist." "That's because Price updated the server firmware 3 months ago without reading the mechanical schematics," Arthur said. Without hesitating for a fraction of a second, he slid flat onto his back on the oil-stained concrete, right under the vibrating strut. He forgot that the physical pressure relief valve on a Vance 700 series isn't digital at all. It's mechanical. Spring-loaded. Arthur reached his calloused hands up into the tight, dark space behind the main gear leg, a gap barely 8 inches wide, dripping with scalding red oil. He pulled the tarnished brass feeler gauge out of his pocket with his left hand and slid the thinnest leaf, 0.03 of an inch, right into the narrow manual bleed slot behind the valve seat. You could have heard a pin drop across that entire 5-acre hangar for 5 agonizing seconds. Just the wet hiss of hot oil, and then, a solid, heavy click. A deep mechanical thump echoed down the length of the fuselage. The screaming whine died down instantly to a soft, smooth hum. High above the gate, the amber warning strobe shut off, replaced by a steady, beautiful green status light over the jetway door. Arthur slid out from under the fuselage, wiped a drop of dark hydraulic fluid off his cheek with his sleeve, and stood up. He wiped the brass gauge clean on his coveralls, folded it shut, and looked up at Gordon Price, who had just jogged down the steel stairs, white-faced and gasping for breath. 0534, Arthur said quietly, checking the old leather band watch on his wrist. 26 minutes to 0600. Flight 412 is clear for departure. Captain Vance stood there staring at the landing gear, then turned around slowly to look at Price. Her face was set like granite. "Gordon," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "Go to your office and get your coat. You and I are going up to the executive suite for the 8 o'clock board audit." Now, if you're like me, you might think Arthur would follow them right up to the executive suite, pull out a chair in that polished oak boardroom, and sit back to watch Gordon Price squirm. But that's not who Arthur is. A man who's spent 44 years with dirt under his fingernails doesn't go looking for applause when an engine turns over. He does what he's done every morning since 1978. He walked over to the heavy cast-iron utility sink at the back of Hangar 4, squeezed a palm-sized dollop of orange pumice soap into his hands, and scrubbed the black hydraulic oil out of his calluses under the cold water pipe. 7:15 a.m. exactly 45 minutes before the full board audit on the 11th floor. And that's when the klaxon started. Not the localized yellow warning lights from Hangar 4, mind you, no, this was the deep, rhythmic pulsing horn that echoed through every loudspeaker across the entire 50-acre terminal complex. Beep. 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 Above the workbench, the main digital departures board, a massive 40-foot LED display that tracked 68 regional flights, flickered once, twice, and then washed entirely into a bright, blinding crimson. Every single flight line turned to red text, Fleet Ground Stop. Code 909. Picture the floor of that terminal at 7:15 on a Monday morning. Thousands of travelers with paper coffee cups, young families heading home, business folks in suit jackets, all standing there watching their departure times vanish. Up on the fourth floor glass catwalk overlooking Hangar 4, the door to the operations control center flew open. Price hadn't made it to the executive suite yet. He was standing at the glass railing, a tablet in his hand, his white knuckles gripping the handrail so hard you could see the bone. Next to him, Captain Vance was already on her radio, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What happened to the central bus?" she demanded, her voice echoing down into the hangar. "Price, why is the entire Midwest grid showing zero pressure feedback?" Price was tapping wildly on his glass screen. His hair was sticking up in 3 directions now, the glossy demeanor completely stripped away. It's a cascade failure," he shouted, his voice cracking like a schoolboy's. The physical bleed on Flight 412 threw a manual spike back into the main telemetry server. The legacy software couldn't reconcile the manual valve position with the digital command, so the automated safety protocol locked down all 14 aircraft in the sector. He looked down at Arthur, who was standing by the sink wiping his hands on a blue paper towel. And right there, in front of 20 mechanics and 3 line supervisors, Price pointed a shaking finger down at the old man. It was his manual override. Price yelled, looking for a life raft and grasping at the nearest straw. He bypassed the server. He put an uncalibrated piece of scrap metal into a digital system and tripped the master breaker for the whole fleet. What would you have done right then? Because if it were me, I might have lost my temper. I might have reminded Mr. Price, who just saved his $4 million jet from burning out its pumps 20 minutes ago. Arthur didn't even raise his voice. He dried his hands, tossed the paper towel into the drum, and picked up his leather-bound pocket ledger and his brass feeler gauge off the bench. 7:22 a.m., Arthur said softly, looking up at the catwalk. "Captain Vance, tell your dispatchers to leave the server alone. If Price tries to force a remote reboot on a code 909, he's going to trip the mechanical emergency locks on every landing gear solenoid from here to O'Hare. He doesn't know what he's talking about." Price stammered, frantically swiping his thumb across the screen. The manual override protocol was retired in the 2011 system overhaul. The master relay box on the OCC wall is just a decorative legacy panel. "It isn't decorative," Arthur said. He walked past the line mechanics, who stepped aside to give him room, and headed toward the spiral staircase leading up to the glass control room. Each step he took was slow, measured, heavy, the steel steps ringing out under his steel-toed boots. You see, what Price didn't know, what nobody in that modern control room knew, was why that master relay box was mounted on the wall in the first place. Back in November of 1991, when the airport authority built the central terminal, the microchips they imported from Germany kept freezing up during sudden winter ice storms. The whole system went dark 3 times in 1 week. So a young lead maintenance engineer spent 36 straight hours in a freezing basement crawlspace, hand-wiring a mechanical bypass loop right through the heart of the main terminal wall. He built it out of heavy copper contacts, spring-loaded relays, and solid American steel, a system that didn't care about software updates, cloud servers, or digital handshakes. A system built to survive when everything else failed. Arthur reached the top of the stairs and walked into the glass-walled operations control center. The room was total chaos. 4 young systems administrators were screaming into headsets, 3 monitors were flashing error codes in bright yellow German script, and Price was sweating right through the collar of his $1,000 suit. "Don't touch that panel." Price snapped as Arthur walked straight past him toward the gray steel enclosure mounted behind the main terminal rack, a box painted industrial dark green, pitted with age, with a simple brass plate riveted to the center. "Gordon," Captain Vance said, standing right between Price and the old man. "Shut your mouth and step back." Arthur didn't look at either of them. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the tarnished brass feeler gauge, and flipped out the thickest blade, the 25,000th leaf. He didn't need a key for the green box. He slipped the brass leaf right into the microscopic gap beneath the lower latch hinge, felt for the internal mechanical catch he had machined himself 33 years ago, and gave it a gentle upward flick. Click. The heavy steel door swung open, revealing 24 thick copper knife switches, dust-covered and untouched for 3 decades, arranged in a perfect, flawless circle around a central mechanical dial. Now, if you've ever seen a 30-something executive look at 33-year-old copper knife switches, you know the exact look that came over Price's face. Pure, unadulterated terror mixed with complete, ignorant contempt. "What is this medieval garbage?" Price blustered, stepping forward with his hands out, as if he were about to grab Arthur by the elbow. "You're going to blow the main transformer. We have $4 million in server architecture linked to that grid. You know what Captain Vance did? He didn't say a single word. He just placed one heavy, leather-gloved hand right in the center of Price's chest and pressed him back 3 steps until the young man's spine hit the glass wall. Arthur didn't even turn around. For 18 a.m. exactly 42 minutes before the first cross-country heavy jet was scheduled to touch down on runway 22 left. Arthur looked at the central dial. The mechanical contact arms inside that green steel box were coated in 30 years of dry dust and ozone grease. If he forced the main rotary switch now, the arc flash would melt the primary contacts, and Concourse B would stay dark for a week. So what did he do? He didn't rush. When you've spent 44 years working with heavy current, you learn that electricity doesn't care about your deadlines, your screaming boss, or your corporate stock options. It only respects cold, hard precision. Arthur wiped the blade of that tarnished brass feeler gauge against the thigh of his grease-stained work trousers. He selected the 12,000th blade, the thin, flexible one he'd used back in '94 to calibrate the fuel injection pumps on the airport's old backup generators. He slipped the brass blade between the upper tungsten contact pads on switch number 7. Scrape. Scrape. A tiny flake of green copper corrosion dropped onto the concrete floor. "He's wasting time." Price shouted into the room, looking at the 4 young IT technicians who were sitting frozen at their glowing monitors. "Someone pull him away from that panel. That's an unauthorized modification." One of those young boys, a kid no older than 24, wearing a neat blue polo shirt with the new contractor's logo on the chest, looked from Price's sweating forehead down to the old man's hands. The kid didn't move an inch. You see, that young man had been staring at red error screens for 6 straight hours. But he was an electrician's son. And when he saw the steady, methodical way Arthur leaned his shoulder into the casing to deaden the mechanical recoil, the kid knew, he just knew, that the man in the grease-stained jacket was the only person in a 3-county radius who actually understood how the blood flowed through that building. Arthur reached out with his bare left hand. He grabbed the heavy Bakelite handle on the main crossover switch. Thunk. A sound like a shotgun going off in a tiled bathroom echoes through the operations control center. A bright blue arc flashed inside the box, casting long, stark shadows across the glass walls. Price flinched so hard he dropped his tablet onto the rubber floor mat. And then, silence. For 3 seconds, not a sound in that room except the hum of the air conditioning. Then, one by one, the bank of monitors along the wall stopped flashing yellow German error codes. The digital terminal map flickered. The red warning icons over Concourse B turned a solid, quiet green. Down on the tarmac, 200 yards away, 3,000 high-intensity LED runway lights flared to life all at once, illuminating the black asphalt like a lit highway in the fog. The 24-year-old technician leaned forward, his mouth slightly open. The main radar feed. He whispered, looking at his console. It's back. The bypass loop didn't hit the main grid, it routed right past the crashed German server. Price stared at the green screens. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again. Well. Obviously, the secondary software patch finally uploaded, he stammered, pulling at his necktie, trying to smooth down his jacket. It was just a timing delay in the cloud signal. A lucky coincidence. Captain Vance looked at Price with a cold, slow smile that didn't reach his eyes. Is that right, Gordon? A cloud signal that sounds like a 30-pound copper switch slamming shut. Arthur quietly folded the brass feeler gauge back into its worn steel case and slipped it into his chest pocket. He shut the heavy green door, pressed the latch down until it clicked, and turned around. He looked right past Price, as if the man were made of clear glass, and looked straight at Captain Vance. Switch 14 is pitted, Arthur said, his voice low and dry, like dry leaves scraping over gravel. It'll hold for 48 hours. Not 49. If you don't manually polish those tungsten contacts with a fine diamond file before Thursday morning, the whole runway lighting grid will lock out permanently. We have a full maintenance contract with a digital logistics firm. Price snapped, his voice tight and high. We don't use diamond files, old man. We replace modular circuit boards. Arthur didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just reached into his collar, pulled out his old brass keycard on its worn leather lanyard, and laid it gently on the edge of the control desk. Day 1, Arthur said softly, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. 47 hours left. He walked toward the heavy steel fire door. Wait, Captain Vance called out, taking a step after him. Arthur. Where are you going? Arthur paused with his hand on the pushbar. Home, Captain. My shift ended at midnight. And according to Mr. Price's new efficiency audit, I don't work here anymore. Now, you have to understand how a man like Gordon Price thinks. Because if you've ever worked with a 30-year-old vice president who thinks a laptop can fix a 50-year-old high-voltage grid, you already know what he did next. He didn't call Arthur. He didn't ask Captain Vance for advice. A man like Price doesn't look at a 47-hour deadline as a warning. He looks at it as a dare. By 2:15 Wednesday afternoon, 36 hours remained on Arthur's invisible clock. The sky over the river valley had turned the color of bruised iron. A heavy spring cold front was rolling in off the coast, bringing 40-knot gusts and driven rain that rattled against the glass of the control tower like handfuls of buckshot. And right on schedule, 2 sleek white vans pulled into the maintenance bay below. Price had brought in his replacement team. 3 young technicians from a regional digital logistics firm out of Boston. Clean navy blue polo shirts with embroidered logos, polished work boots that had never touched a drop of grease, and silver aluminum hard cases filled with fresh, modular circuit cards. Price brought them right up to the 3rd floor observation deck, right where 2 regional inspectors from the Federal Aviation Administration were standing with heavy leather binders under their arms. Regional Director Hayes and Senior Inspector Miller had flown in specifically to audit the airport's weather landing safety rating. As you can see, gentlemen, Price was saying, pouring fresh dark roast from a stainless steel thermal pot into ceramic mugs, we're actively phasing out the legacy clutter. No more reliance on off-grid manual adjustments or union overtime. We've automated the entire power distribution tree. Inspector Miller didn't touch his coffee. He looked out the floor-to-ceiling glass at the runway lights flickering softly in the driving rain. Mr. Price, Miller said in a flat, dry voice, this sector operates on a legacy 4160-volt step-down loop built back in 1974. Do these digital relays have high harmonic dampeners? Price waved a hand, a smooth, effortless gesture. There's solid state, Inspector. State-of-the-art cloud-integrated modules. The vendor guarantees 99.9% uptime. And right on cue, the storm hit the primary substation out on County Road 9. It wasn't a direct lightning strike. Just a routine voltage spike, a 2200-volt harmonic surge riding back through the secondary line as the wind whipped two high-tension cables together. Inside the control tower, there was no loud bang. Just a soft, wet pop from the main junction box in the wall, followed immediately by the acrid, chemical stench of scorched resin and melting silicone. Every shiny flat-screen monitor on Price's main console flickered, turned bright magenta, and went dead gray. A tiny red box flashed in the corner of the auxiliary backup display, error code 702 Delta. Hardware sync failure. Down on the main runway, 42 heavy-intensity approach lights went pitch black in the middle of a torrential downpour. Price's smile froze solid. "It's just a momentary handshake delay," he stammered, tapping frantically on his touchscreen tablet. "The automatic failover protocol will bridge the load in 4 seconds." 10 seconds passed. 20 seconds. The runway stayed pitch black. Meanwhile, 6 miles down the valley, in a small white frame house on Elm Street, Arthur sat at his kitchen table. A single mug of black coffee sat steaming beside a plate of dry toast. On the yellowed oilcloth table lay that same worn steel case. Arthur opened the clasp with a small, quiet snap, pulled out the 0.015-inch brass feeler gauge, and used the polished metal edge to gently clear a speck of dust from the glass dial of his old 1968 Zenith transistor radio. The radio crackled softly on the table, notice to Air Commerce. Regional Sector 4 reporting primary landing guidance system offline, all incoming commercial traffic hold at 30,000 feet. Arthur didn't jump up. He didn't reach for his phone. He took a slow sip of his coffee, pulled his 1954 Hamilton pocket watch from his vest, and clicked the cover open. 28 hours remaining. Back in the tower, Price's voice was climbing an octave higher with every passing minute. The lead technician from the Boston contractor was kneeling in front of the open junction cabinet with a pair of insulated pliers, staring at a smoking black module in total disbelief. "The board completely fried," the tech muttered, his face pale in the emergency fluorescent lighting. "The board didn't step down the voltage surge, it absorbed it." "Then replace it," Price hissed, looking nervously over his shoulder at the 2 FAA inspectors, who were already writing furiously in their black logbooks. "You brought 6 spare modules in those cases." "Mr. Price," the tech said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead, "we can snap in a fresh board, but as soon as the main switch cycles, the raw line power will fry the new one too. There's no manual transformer dampener on this rig." Captain Vance stepped forward from the dark corner of the room. He didn't look at Price. He looked right at the young technician. "The dampener isn't on the board, son," Vance said quietly. "It's a 30-pound solid copper rheostat mounted on the subterranean wall behind junction box 4. It has to be manually dialed back 2 notches during an easterly gale." The young technician looked up, completely blank. "A manual rheostat?" "Sir, that's not on any of our digital schematics." "It's not on the schematics," Vance said, turning his cold gaze directly onto Price, "because Gordon here threw out the original laminated schematics 3 weeks ago to make room for a coffee bar in the break room." Inspector Miller snapped his binder shut with a sound like a pistol shot. "Price, if that primary approach array isn't certified and operational by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I'm pulling this facility's commercial landing permit. You'll be diverting 4 heavy cargo flights to Chicago at a penalty of $350,000 per plane. Charged directly to your operating budget." Price's collar suddenly looked 3 sizes too small for his neck. We can rush ship a heavy-duty surge suppressor from the warehouse in Atlanta," he pleaded, his voice thin and trembling. "It'll be here by tomorrow evening." "Tomorrow evening," Captain Vance said softly, checking his own wrist, is 19 hours too late. Now, you have to picture Gordon Price's face right then. The color didn't just drain out of him, it looked like someone squeezed every drop of pride right out of his skin. For heavy cargo haulers sitting on the tarmac in Memphis, waiting for the green light to fly into this hub. If those planes had to divert, that was $1.4 million out of Price's Regional Operations Fund. $1.4 million for a 15-minute delay, all because he wanted a granite-topped espresso machine where the schematics cabinet used to sit. What would you have done? Well, if you're Gordon Price, you don't turn around and apologize. No, a man built on pride will exhaust every single bad idea before he ever touches a good one. 18 hours to the 8 o'clock deadline. Price pulled his young lead technician into the hallway, just out of earshot of the FAA guys, or so he thought. "Find that subterranean box," Price snapped, his voice barely a whisper, vibrating with panic. "I don't care if it's not on your iPads. Take a flashlight and go down the access tunnel under runway 3 right." The tech looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Mr. Price, subterranean tunnel 4 has been sealed off since the retrofit. And even if we find the manual rheostat, the emergency hatch down there is secured with a mechanical deadbolt." Price threw his hands up. "Then use the electronic keycard." The digital strike plate blew out when the array shorted. "Sir," the boy said quietly. It locked down. "The only way into that vault now is the old mechanical master key. The 5-pin brass double bit." Price went stone still. And here's the part nobody in that hallway was supposed to know. 6 months ago, when Price took over this facility, he ordered every manual key, every brass lock cylinder, and every paper logbook collected in plastic tubs. He called it clearing out the legacy clutter. He handed those tubs to the scrap contractor and told them to melt it all down. Price looked back toward the end of the hall. Captain Vance was sitting quietly on a metal folding chair by the emergency exit. He had his silver pocket watch out, 40 years of service engraved on the back, polished so smooth from his thumb resting on it that you couldn't even read the date anymore. Vance wasn't looking at Price. He was just watching the second-hand sweep across the dial. Tick. 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 Price walked over, his expensive Italian leather shoes squeaking on the linoleum. Every single eyes in that corridor, the 2 FAA inspectors, the 3 line techs, the shift supervisor, followed him. "Vance," Price said, forcing a tight, hollow smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You used to keep a duplicate set of facility keys in your desk. Before we reorganized." Vance didn't look up from his watch. "I did. Room 304, desk drawer 2. "Right," Price said, clearing his throat. "Where did you store them when we cleared the maintenance floor?" Vance snapped the pocket watch shut with a soft click that seemed to echo down the whole hall. "In the scrap bin. Exactly where your written memo instructed me to put them. You could have heard a pin drop on that concrete floor." Inspector Miller didn't even look up from his black logbook. He just clicked his pen once. The sound was like a hammer cocking. Price took a breath, his chest heaving, his tie crooked. "Vance. Captain Vance. This is a critical infrastructure emergency. If those cargo flights divert, the entire southeastern logistics network backs up till Thursday. Now, I know we had our administrative differences regarding modern workflow." "Administrative differences," Vance repeated, his voice smooth and calm as a frozen pond. "Is that what you call telling a man who spent 34 years keeping this runway open during ice storms and hurricane winds that his experience was an unnecessary line item expense?" Price swallowed hard. His forehead was slick with sweat under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Captain, please. If you know another way into subterranean Vault 4, I am asking for your assistance." Notice how the tone changes when the check comes due. Vance stood up. He wasn't tall, but when he stood, he filled that hallway in a way Price never could. He reached deep into the pocket of his worn canvas work coat, the coat Price had tried to ban from the floor because it didn't match the new corporate dress code. Vance pulled out a heavy metal ring. Tied to it, right next to his original union tag from 1982, was a thick, tarnished brass key with 2 notched bits on the blade. Price stared at it like it was made of solid gold. He reached his hand out to grab it. Vance didn't hand it over. He pulled it back half an inch, just enough to make Price stop cold. 17 hours to the deadline. This key opens the lower vault, Vance said quietly, looking Price right in the eye. But opening the hatch doesn't fix your array, Gordon. That copper rheostat is 40 years old. If your tech turns that dial 2 degrees past the notch without bleeding off the static load first, the residual current will detonate the entire transformer housing. And you won't be paying $350,000 to divert flights. You'll be calling the city fire department. Price stared at that brass key. You could see the gears turning in his head, trying to find a shortcut, trying to calculate whether he could bypass a man who had 40 years of dirt under his fingernails with a 100-page corporate manual. 16 hours to the deadline. Price pulled back his shoulders, trying to adjust his jacket like he was still the smartest guy in the room. We have a certified electrical engineering team on standby, Captain Vance, Price said, his voice tightening up real thin. They have modern digital diagnostic equipment. They don't need a rheostat. They're going to bridge the primary feed directly from the junction box. Vance didn't argue. He didn't even raise his voice. He just took that brass key, slipped it back onto his ring, and dropped it into the pocket of his canvas coat. The heavy fabric made a soft thud against his hip. You tell young Brandon down there to watch the ground wire on panel 4, Vance said softly. The insulation burned off in November of '94 during the ice freeze. If he bridges that line without tapping the manual drain first, he's going to backfeed 800 volts right into your digital rig. Price turned on his heel and walked off down the corridor, his expensive dress shoes clicking double time against the polished tile. He was going to prove he didn't need the old guard. Now, ask yourself this. How many times have you watched a mid-level manager burn down $500,000 worth of machinery just to avoid saying the word sorry? 15 hours to the deadline. Vance sat right down on the worn wooden bench by the service elevator. He unscrewed the cup from his old green thermos, poured himself a shot of black coffee, and set his black logbook across his knees. He didn't look anxious. He looked like a man sitting on a porch waiting for a summer thunderstorm he'd watched build on the horizon 3 hours ago. 10 minutes later, the lights in the main terminal didn't just flicker, they died. A heavy, sickening silence fell over the concourse, followed instantly by the deep, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the emergency diesel generators kicking in down in the basement. Then came the smell. If you've ever been near high-voltage electrical gear when a transformer takes a surge, you know that smell. Scorched copper and burnt resin, sharp enough to make your eyes water from 50 yards away. A minute after that, the service elevator doors rattled open. Out came Brandon, Price's lead systems specialist. The young man's white button-down shirt was gray with soot around the collar. His $3,000 digital analyzer was dangling from his left hand, smoke still rising from the rubberized diagnostic port. Behind him came Price, stumbling out into the dim hallway light, his face pale as chalk, a thin sheen of oil across his forehead. It backfed, Brandon stammered, his voice cracking like a schoolboy's. The ground fault, the insulation was gone. The board went up instantly. Price looked down the hallway. Vance hadn't moved an inch. He was holding his coffee cup with both hands, taking a slow sip. The ILS board is down, Price whispered, and for the first time, you could hear the terror in his chest. The landing system for the whole sector just went blind. They're queuing 12 cargo flights over Charlotte right now. If we don't restore primary power in 14 hours. 14 hours, Vance corrected softly, setting his cup down on the wooden bench with a quiet clink. Actually, Gordon, you've got about 45 minutes before the battery backups for the secondary radio stack overheat and trip the thermal breakers. And when those go, you aren't just diverting flights to Atlanta. You're shutting down airspace from here to the coast. Price walked over to the bench. Slowly. Every step looked like it was costing him 10 years of pride. He stood over Vance, his hands shaking at his sides. What do you want? Price squeezed out, the words almost choking him. Name your figure. A consulting fee. A retention package. Whatever line item I have to clear with regional office, I will sign it right now. Vance reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his black logbook again. He didn't flip to an invoice. He didn't pull out a contract. He opened it to a yellowed newspaper clipping taped inside the front cover, dated October 14, 1988. There was a photograph of a younger Vance standing next to a regional director in a three-piece suit, both of them standing in front of the very transformer housing down in Vault 4. Underneath the photo was a single line of text: Chief Engineer Vance leads emergency restoration of District 4 power grid following historic ice grid failure. Price stared at the headline. Then he looked at Vance. You built the ground grid. I laid the copper lines with my own hands, Gordon, Vance said, his voice flat and quiet as river stone. My brother helped me pull the main conduits through 6 feet of frozen mud while your company was still writing its first brochure. I know every bolt, every relay, and every frayed wire in that sub-basement because I put them there. 14 hours to the deadline. Vance stood up slowly, picking up his thermos. I don't want your consulting fee, Price. And I don't want a line item. He held out his hand, palm up. I want your keycard to the director's office. And I want you to walk down to the floor right now and tell every technician on that floor who is going to fix this board. Now, you should have seen Gordon Price's face in that moment. His eyes darted toward the dark hallway, then down at his own polished executive shoes. He knew he was trapped. Slowly, with fingers that looked like they'd lost all their strength, Price unclipped the gold-bordered director's keycard from his belt and laid it right on top of that yellowed 1988 news clipping. Vance didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just picked up the card, dropped it into his shirt pocket alongside his trusty brass tire gauge, and walked out of the break room. Price followed 2 steps behind, looking like a man marching straight to his own trial. They stepped out onto the glass-walled mezzanine overlooking the central routing floor. Down below, 30 young technicians in crisp, white dress shirts were huddled around the main console, voices rising in panic as the digital screens flashed amber and red. 28 minutes left before the regional thermal breakers tripped. Price stepped up to the public address microphone mounted on the railing. He cleared his throat. The sharp screech of feedback echoed through the high steel rafters, and every single head on that floor turned upward. Attention, Price's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, cracking just a bit on the second syllable. Effective immediately. Chief Engineer Vance is taking full operational command of Sector 4. You could have heard a paperclip drop on that polished concrete floor. The 3 young hotshots who had sneered at Vance's faded Union jacket 3 hours earlier stood completely frozen, mouths open. Price took a deep, shuddering breath, looked down at the floor below, and then spoke into the microphone again. And this was the part that broke every bit of pride left in him. I was wrong, Price said, his voice echoing off the high steel beams. Vance isn't an outdated liability. He built this grid. He knows every inch of it. And not one person in this room is qualified to hold his flashlight. Vance didn't waste a single second. He walked down the iron spiral stairs, stepped right past the frozen technicians, and opened panel 14B, the exact relay housing he'd soldered by hand back in the freeze of '88. With 3 precise turns of his offset socket wrench, he bypassed the burned-out digital sensor, bridged the copper heat sink with a manual copper jumper, and reset the primary ground breaker. A deep, rhythmic hum vibrated straight up through the floorboards. The kind of low rumble you feel in your chest before you hear it in your ears. One by one, across that massive glass display wall, the flashing warning lights flipped from harsh emergency amber to steady, cool green. Airspace clear. Grid stabilized. Down on the floor, Price walked up to Vance in front of the entire shift. He extended his hand, not as a supervisor, but as a man who'd just been shown what 40 years of honest trade actually means. "I'm submitting my transfer to regional in the morning," Price whispered quietly. "This station belongs to you, Vance." Vance gave a short, firm nod and shook the man's hand. "Just make sure the next young fellow you hire knows how to use a wrench, Gordon. If you walk down into Vault 4 today, you won't find Gordon Price. But you will see Vance sitting at that same wooden workbench in the sub-basement. He didn't take the director's air-conditioned corner office upstairs. He let young Danny, the 19-year-old apprentice who was the only one to offer him a cup of coffee that morning, sit up top and watch the screens. Every afternoon at 2:15 p.m., Danny comes down to the basement with 2 paper cups of black coffee, sits on a wooden crate, and opens Vance's old black logbook. Vance is teaching him how the copper lines talk when the frost sets in. You see, in a world that's always rushing toward the newest, shiniest thing, it's easy to forget about the quiet hands that built the foundation under our feet. We look at gray hair and worn boots and think someone's past their prime. But shiny paint doesn't hold up a roof when the storm comes. Experience does. Craftsmanship does. And those quiet folks who do the work without asking for applause, they're the ones who keep the world running when everything else fails.